I'm your host, Don Corleone, and today we're going to talk about blind versus blind single raise spots from the perspective of the big blind. Today, we're going to look into this spot, and we're going to try to use the lens of what types of mistakes are we likely to make in different directions, and what type of mistakes our opponents are likely to make in different directions, right? So common mistakes you're probably making, and destroy the small blind. And between parentheses, I write there bad extrapolations. And by bad extrapolations, I mean that usually for you and for your opponent, leagues will change from one time to another, from one player to another. But a very common league that is just going to be very just based on human psychology is taking a spot that you understand and and extrapolating that to other spots. And so a lot of mistakes that happen blind versus blind will happen because either you or your opponent have learned about bottom versus big blind or about some other spot, and you just try to play basically the same, right? And that doesn't quite work. We're also going to talk about some little tips, like practical advice for how to study and fix some of the more common mistakes that I see. Why does this matter? Blind versus blind is one of the most common situations in poker that people still neglect, right? So the most common situation in poker is going to be single raise spot, in position opens, big blind calls, right? Especially if it's like cutoff versus big blind, bottom versus big blind, that's the most common spot. But people have that down relatively well compared to other spots, right? Blind versus blind is not as common, but then people are just winging it constantly. I see even at relatively high stakes, people still just using sizings that are really contrary to a good understanding of the spot, or just playing strategies that don't make that much sense. Your opponent has the lead and is out of position. And that's a big room for imbalances, okay? Why do I say that? Why don't I say why is it more, it's not difficult, but why is it more likely to lead to mistakes when you have the lead and are out of position, rather than, for example, when you don't have the lead and are out of position? So, of course, if you're more of a beginner player, you're just going to have trouble everywhere, especially out of position, right? But I would say that generally speaking, defending versus bets, even though it feels bad because your EV is lower, the decisions behind calling or folding are a lot more streamlined. It's a lot easier to understand where your threshold is for calling and folding versus a bet. But when it comes to you having the lead, you are very prone to making all kinds of mistakes that are based on balance. So, for example, a player might bluff too much, right? Even if it's just by a little bit, that's already a big lead. Or a player might not bluff enough, or they might bluff with too high equity, or maybe they bluff with too low equity, or maybe they trap too much. Maybe they don't trap enough, right? There's just a lot of mistakes that are not like big mistakes in of themselves. They don't feel as bad, but an opponent could take advantage of those mistakes. In this case, you could take advantage of your opponent having the lead, being out of position, and having those sorts of imbalances. A proper big blind strategy puts weaker players in many tough spots they're not used to. So in my experience, as I said, people use very wrong sizings in all the spots. They just structure their strategy in ways that don't make sense for the ranges involved. And so a lot of people are just not used to facing good strategies, right? For example, like they check the flop, they don't expect to face an overbet, or they don't expect you to pot the flop, or they don't expect you to do certain things. And so, so just by playing normal, you're already putting people in a lot of unknown situations for them. So let's first talk about facing a flop c-bet, which is what's going to happen the majority of the time, probably. not necessarily in GTO, but in practice, you will usually face a c-bet. One very important thing is to make sure to not overfold this node unless you're doing it on purpose, right? Like you could have an exploit on your opponent. You could think, oh, this guy is just like betting very, very strong on the flop, and so I should fold. That's a fair adjustment. But what I see, I've had a lot of students, and what I see when I look at their databases, the most common thing that happens here is that people just fold way, way, way too much. And that is already a bad extrapolation from bottom versus big blind, because bottom versus big blind, the ranges are similar, but you are out of position. So you are supposed to fold a lot more than when you're in position, right? Maybe out of position, you're supposed to fold 40% versus small bet. Maybe in position, you're supposed to fold 20% for the same bet on the same board, right? So it's easy to overfold on drier, especially on drier boards where you don't have as many like clear front door draws and that type of stuff. And so you need to be very careful with that. One way in which I found, a lot of players have improved, and I find I do it a lot as well, is GTO Wizard drills. I'll explain later how to set them up, in my opinion, for fixing this particular league that most of the guys at this call are probably having. And even if you're watching later the recording, you'll probably have it as well. And also raising is a very important tool for punishing players who extrapolate bottom versus big blind strategy. The main reason, so there's two reasons, okay? First of all, raising a lot is just a GTO concept, right? Like raising aggressively is a good, sound strategy. But especially when you have players who some flops, they will see that too often, for example, then your response should be to raise more, right? And there's also players who, as we will see later, don't 3-bet the flop enough, right? And so if you don't raise enough, you are kind of playing into their league. If someone is not 3-betting the flop enough and you're not raising him enough, you're just making the wrong kind of deviation. You would have to raise more versus his c-bet, the less he 3-bets the flop, right? So we're going to look at 10-10-5 rainbow. So I picked on purpose an extremely dry board, no straight draws, rainbow. And this is one of the boards where it's tougher to defend properly. So as we can see, we're supposed to fold only about 22% of the time, right? If this was bottom versus big blind, we could fold maybe closer to 40. I'm not sure the exact number, but closer to in the 30s or like high 30s, something like that. And this is already like a mistake that a lot of people are going to make, which is, not calling with hands like Queen 2 of hearts ever, not calling with hands like these sorts of backdoors with backdoor flush draw, backdoor straight draw, right? If you look at the reports versus small bet, the average fold should be 25, and the average raise should be around 13. Okay? Now, as you can see, also the raises on this particular board are extremely aggressive, extremely aggressive, right? 22% of the time. More like 23. Yeah, like 22, 23. And it's easy to forget to do a lot of these raises with just random hands, right? And the problem with that is not just that it's not GTO, right? It's not just, I raised 10% instead of 20% with a hand. That's not the point. Point is that let's look at when we raise, how many 3-bets are we supposed to face? So on average, on this line, they bet small, we raise for half pot. They are supposed to 3-bet the flop about 12%, which is basically the same frequency that we are raising ourselves, right? This is very different from other spots where you're supposed to check raise, maybe versus the button with, I don't know, 13-14% of the time. And then they are supposed to 3-bet on most boards like 2% of the time, 1% or 0, right? If someone extrapolates, they will end up making a mistake there. So it's very important to, as a default, not be underdoing the raises, because you could be running into the, basically you want to be, if you are going to make an error, you want to make an error in at least a possibly correct direction. Okay? So very important here to be raising. As you can see, he's supposed to 3-bet on this particular board about 13% of the time, right? So let's talk about some of the potential mistakes that someone could be making. So on this board particularly, I would say that people probably are range betting, most people, and is probably fairly good, okay? Like this strategy, even though it only bets 65% of the time, it's close enough to a range bet because it's very spread out. Like all of the hands are very mixed in both lines. It's not like certain hands are definitely out of the bet. So it's kind of a similar thing. But I think people are generally just playing fine when they bet this flop. Range betting is just a fine strategy. So I wouldn't really try to look too much into that. But definitely there's going to be a lot of players that don't 3-bet enough. Okay. So against those players, we would have to raise more. And then there's going to be some people potentially who 3-bet the flop too much. Okay. That also does exist. And then obviously the adjustment would be the opposite, right? Now, if we change to a board like, for example, 6-6-5 two-tone, okay? Now, as you can see, this is actually closer to a range check than a range bet, right? And a lot of people are not doing this, okay? Let's be honest, right? So let's look at the raise right off the bat. Again, very similar, 20-something%, right? But now imagine if this player was range betting, for example, okay? This raise would automatically increase by, I don't know how many percentage points, but it would definitely increase, right? Maybe 30, maybe 40%, right? And then when we raise, he's supposed to 3-bet, again, about 13% of the time. So again, all of these things are compounding to the point that if someone is extrapolating strategy from other spots to this spot, which is very different, the leaks can compound into such a big mistake that we could be looking into calling more, right? So folding less in general and raising significantly more, raising 40, 50, 60% of the time against some players, right? Or you could have players that actually just range check this board, right? A player that range checks this board is actually going to have a bit of a stronger range than he should when he checks, right? So when he checks, you should be aware of that. Right? There's many different ways to exploit different players, but the important thing is that you understand what the incentives are, right? If someone is c-betting too often, basically their betting range is too weak, right? They're not allowed to bet so much air, basically. And so you can raise more for that. If they are not 3-betting enough, then your raises realize equity for free. You can basically raise in position. They don't 3-bet you enough. They just call, you get to turn, check, and you have easy river decisions, right? The reason why you have to 3-bet a lot more out of position is because when you are in position, you don't need to deny as much equity from your opponent. You can just play very high EV turns and rivers on a higher SPR, right? But when you're out of position, it's more beneficial to lower the SPR. It's more beneficial to deny equity by 3-betting the flop. So that's a possible mistake that people will be making. When it comes to what I was talking about, how to get better at flop defense specifically, what I find very helpful, and I do this very often, as you can see, I have a billion drills that I created. This specific one, what I would do is I would create a small blind open, big blind call, small blind bet small. You could create also one for small blind bets bigger, just different sizings. The smaller sizing definitely the most important to nail down. And what I would do is make sure that you go into settings and set up to the spot mode. To fix your defense versus flop c-bet, you don't want to play the whole hand. You don't want to get good at rivers or whatever for this specific exercise. I would say it's mostly just to build a almost intuitive knowledge about what hands call and what hands fold, right? So set it up to spot so that basically whenever you call or fold, it moves on to the next hand, right? It doesn't keep playing the hand, it just moves on to the next hand. Or you could do street or spot, both are fine. Now that doesn't mean that on every drill you should do this. I just mean for this specific purpose of fixing your flop defense, which for most people is completely screwed, this will be super helpful. All right, so we're going to look at stabbing the flop. Basically, we're going to face a check on flop, and we have the opportunity to bet or check back. Okay, it's easy to have an equity-driven betting range. Okay, it's very easy for you to have an equity-driven betting range. What is an equity-driven betting range? Well, it's when you bet with top pairs, you bet with hands that need protection, so like thin value. You bet with draws, flush draws, straight draws, gut shots, and maybe you bet with like overcards with a backdoor flush or something like that, right? And then what do you check? Well, you check really weak hands, like air, and then you check some middling hands. That's a very, very equity-driven range. Okay, not a very good strategy because this is going to cost a lot of overfolding after checking back. So you've spent all this time training your defense for c-bet. Let's say I'm playing against you, right? I'm on the small blind. You've trained all this time. Now your flop defense is perfect. It's actually seamless. I look at your stats. Oh, this is great. We've played together 50,000 hands. As, oh my God, this guy is defending the flop like amazingly. But then I see that you fold 60% of the time versus a delay c-bet, right? All of the work that you put into defending the flop will be wasted because with all of my air, I will just check the flop and bet the turn, right? And you will get exploited to the same extent, right? So it's important that you understand as a default strategy how to not be equity driven. Against some players, you definitely want to be equity driven though, right? If an opponent is very passive, you might want to play equity driven yourself, but just not without understanding what's going on, right? It's okay to play in many different ways versus different players, but you have to know why you're doing it. You can't just autopilot into a strategy that's very suboptimal, right? Make sure to check enough decent hands and to bet enough weak hands. Okay, that's a very common leak that I see as well, and in databases that I review. It's just people don't check enough good hands, and they don't bet enough weak hands. Bet sizing is not based on how wet the board is, but on the polarity of red. There's another misconception that comes more from old school, or that comes also from extrapolating from bottom versus big blind, where bottom versus big blind, you look at the bottom c-bet range, c-bet sizing, and it tends to align with the fact that on more wet boards, you c-bet bigger, and on more dry boards, you c-bet smaller. That tends to be the case, right? But I would say that that's more of it's not a complete coincidence, but it's more of a coincidence that people give it credit for. And you will see that blind versus blind, it actually doesn't, it's just not how it works. It's just not how it works. It's based on the polarity of ranges. So is my opponent condensed? Is my opponent does he have a range advantage? Does he have a range disadvantage? Like that sort of thing. If an opponent has an imbalanced checking range, we can funnel hands into certain lines, okay? So at low stakes, you should try to learn how to play proper poker, right? But you should also pay a lot of attention to what kinds of mistakes certain opponents are making, right, with their checking range, which, as I said in one of the beginning slides, it's very, very easy to have imbalances in the check line, right? And exploiting those is going to be done by funneling hands to the bet line or into the check line, that sort of thing. Okay, so let's do a little quiz. Ace, 9, 4, two-tone, and stop size. How big should we stab? A lot of you, if you have studied this spot, will already know the answer. Some of you might not. But basically, yeah, let's just try to get to the bottom of this. How big should we stab on Ace, 9, 4, two-tone? And if you want to write in the chat why do you think a certain sizing is picked, you can definitely leave your thoughts there. I see basically a mix of answers. I see a bit of everything. What's the million? Don't cheat, guys. Still look at the sin. Yeah, I definitely see a little bit of everything. And that little bit of everything is actually what you're going to face in game, right? When you are on Ace, 9, 4, two-tone and you check in the small blind, what you will face in terms of stab sizing is just all across the board. Now, in reality, in theory, you should basically face only one sizing or just like a similar set of sizings, but different people just approach the spot in different ways. So let's finish the vote. And what we see is that the answer is overbet. 75% pot would be fine. It's not a terrible sizing, but the 1/3 sizing is going to be definitely wrong. Okay, it's going to be definitely wrong. As I said just before, the sizing is not based on how dry the board is, how wet the board is. It's not the same as when you play bottom versus big blind, because the sizing that you choose is based on range interaction. And very often, the range interaction is such that as the big blind, you have the opposite incentives. Not always, but usually you have the opposite incentives than the PFR. As the caller, you have kind of like the opposite incentives to the PFR. If the PFR has a middle of the range advantage, then he's going to want to bet small. You don't want to bet small if he has a middle of the range advantage, right? If he has a top of range advantage, he wants to bet big. You don't want to bet big, right? So it's not about the board itself. You can't look at the board and just know immediately what sizing is best for that board. It will be different for the two players involved in the spot. So let's look at Ace, 9, 4. Let's look at Ace, 9, 4, where the big blind has a big range disadvantage, and we can only leverage the fact that out of position checked. Why do I mean by that? Basically, the in position player is screwed all across the range. The out of position player has less air. He has more ace-x. He has more kings, queens, jacks, tens. He probably has more 9x. Just has more of anything that's good and less than anything that's bad, right? So then what sizing do you pick? Well, the sizing that you pick leverages the fact that the out of position player checked. Okay, the out of position player checked, which means they are condensing their range towards hands like kings, for example, right? And so he is not completely capped. He should, in theory, check with some two pairs, some sets, etc. But he's going to mostly bet those hands while you always have them in your range, right? So that's kind of the idea. So as we can see, the main sizing picked here is the small overbet. If you pick 75% pot or check, that is not bad. I would approve of that, or pot or check, any of those like close sizes. So for you who answered 75% pot, I don't think that's like a wrong way to approach the spot. I think the one that would be definitely wrong would be to do out 1/3 or check. Because let's look at the checking range, okay? So first of all, let's look at the ranges. Okay. And when we see the ranges, the big blind is basically screwed everywhere except this little breathing room, right? This little spot is where the big blind has an advantage. Why does the big blind have an advantage there? Well, because the small blind checked. That's the only reason, right? If we look at the range here, as it arrives to the flop, the big blind is just screwed everywhere, right? There's basically no sizing. If these were the ranges involved, then the big blind would just check the entire range, probably, or something like that, right? But because the small blind checks, we getting his range at the top, he's getting more capped, not fully capped, but somewhat capped. Now, the only sizing that makes sense is the overbet. And let's look at the checking range, right? So let's look at what hands make sense as checks the most, right? Of course, as I said, ace 9 and 9s are sometimes going to check, but not the majority of the time, while hands like kings, king, queen, king, jack, queens, jacks, these hands check the majority of the time. These hands check the majority of the time. Some of these hands, like ace 2 maybe ace 3, right? These hands check. These are very condensed towards the middle, right? Imagine if his range was actually only those hands, right? Let's just imagine his range is only those hands. What sizing would you pick? Right? It doesn't really make sense to pick the small sizing because you're just not denying any equity with any hands. And you're not going to bet probably like a 4 into this, right? You're not going to take a 4 and bet against this range. So it doesn't really make that much sense. It makes sense to bet with a polar range against this condensed range, right? So yeah, we leverage those two pairs and sets that he is mostly not going to check. Now, what are some mistakes that are easy for you to make? So one of the mistakes would be being equity driven. Okay, being equity driven would be just betting a bunch of ace-x, right? Oh, I have an ace. Just bet ace, and then check that hands. If I have, for example, 10-7, I bet when I have a flush draw, and I check when I don't have a flush draw. Like that's being equity driven. And that's a problem because then you don't have a lot of hands that can defend versatile c-bet, and your stab range is extremely strong. If you take out this hand to add more of this hand, your betting range, even though you have the same amount of quote-unquote bluff combos, your range has a lot of equity. Your betting range has a lot higher equity. So you're making a very strong betting range and a very weak checking range, which makes it so that I can, for example, check air on the flop and then bet the turn and get some free fold equity, right? So you have to be careful with that very common leak by checking back a lot of top pairs, by making sure to not just autopilot check all of these mediocre bluffs, right? We need to bluff with some mediocre bluffs. And also, let's look at what possible mistakes are likely to be made as the small blind. So there's different type of players, and let's actually look at the range that I outlined before, something like this range. Let's say someone who has a range that's very, very based around these hands. Now, the solver is based around these hands, but it has a lot of mixing going on, right? It mixes a bunch of other stuff as well. Now, some players understand that these hands tend towards checking, but they do it in a ABC face-up way, right? So they check these hands and they bet the rest, right? So what is the proper adjustment against that? Well, certainly betting small would become probably a lot worse. So now his range is extremely, extremely condensed and extremely, extremely capped, right? What you would want to do against that range would be to bet very big, and you could bet very thin. For example, if this is his actual checking range, now ace 5 plus is basically the nuts, right? Ace 5 plus is basically the nuts. So what you could do is bet extremely thin, like ace 5 plus, for an overbet sizing, right? Against this player, that would be the correct adjustment, to take all of that thinner value and just overbet it very aggressively, right? So that's one possible mistake that someone could be making. how would you detect that on the HUD? Well, you could see just overall very ABC tendencies, but one possible stat that could give it away would be having a very low check raise. Right? Having a very low check raise on flop as the PFR, right? Not as, not calling the big blind and not check raising, but this particular thing where they check the small blind and then they don't check raise. That would give away the fact that they are extremely condensed slash capped. What's another possible mistake? Well, you would have a guy who's potentially equity driven. So what would be an equity driven guy? Well, an equity driven guy would be a guy that bets with sets, bets with two pairs, bets with top pair, bets with under pairs because they need protection, bets with second pairs because they need protection, etc., etc., etc. Right? This basically, our common leak is overestimating the need for protection. Okay, and people who do this are going to have an equity-driven range because they bet too thin for protection, and usually these players will just bluff with equity and check with no equity and with like very middling hands. That would lead to an extremely weak checking range and an extremely strong betting range. Not strong in terms of like, oh, it's always the nuts, but it's strong in terms of just the average hand has a lot of equity, right? So the correct adjustment would be, of course, to overfold versus the bet and to attack the check extremely aggressive, right? To bluff relentlessly against checks and also bluffing thinner as well. Now, how could you detect this? Well, the low check raise on flop is also kind of a giveaway for that type of thing. But now the check fold is a more important detail as well. How much does he check fold after checking the flop in the small blind? That's going to give away the fact that he's doing this kind of thing, right? And now the other type of player that you can come across, which is going to be probably less common at lower stakes, it starts happening more at higher stakes. It's basically the player that is aware of this dynamic, right? Like at some point you realize, oh, I shouldn't be equity driven. It's very easy to exploit my checks. So what do I do to fix it? Well, there's this kind of player, which is the aggro trappy kind of guy, right? The aggro trappy kind of guy. So the aggro trappy kind of guy is a guy that's going to basically bluff everything on a flop like this. So they take 10-6 of diamonds. They just bluff it all the time. They basically range bet. They check maybe some of these hands, right? And then they check aces sometimes. Maybe they check ace-9. They try to be trappy and very aggressive, right? That would be basically the opposite case of the equity-driven person, right? It would be basically the opposite of the equity-driven person, where this guy, the exploit, would be to completely disrespect his bets, right? His bets now are depleted of good hands, so we should raise a lot, call a lot, that type of stuff. And we should actually respect his checks a lot, right? We should basically attack his bets, avoid applying pressure against his checks, while against the equity-driven guy, we should attack his checks and avoid going crazy against his bets. Right. So as you can see in poker, like good poker, besides in anonymous pools where you can't really know who your opponent specifically is, but good poker relies to some extent on building this kind of reads on your opponent, because what's very good against one person could be extremely bad against another, right? It could be that you want to play two completely opposite approaches against two different people. Right? This is why autopiloting playing 20 tables might not be the best idea for most people if you want to get to a high level, right? You want to actually be having a flexible play style most of the time. And now some people are less flexible than others, right? Like you look at top level players, there's more like GTO based with some deviations, and then there's some like completely wild guys. But everyone has both things to some extent. Everyone has a solid baseline, a solid understanding of the game, and some amount of deviations. So what happens after calling c-bet? We are not usually looking to fully give up air. It is a mistake that some people make. When you float the flop with like a backdoor flush draw, backdoor straight draw, that type of thing, you don't need to like, then he checks the turn and you overbet, go crazy, or you don't have to go crazy always, but what you don't do, generally speaking, on most boards, is to completely give up with no showdown, right? If you call the flop with 8 high, usually you either bet the turn if he checks, or if he checks the turn, maybe you check back and then bet the river, or maybe you bet the turn, bet the river, or bet the turn, check the river. But what you usually are not supposed to do is call the flop with 8 high, he checks the turn, you check back, he checks the river, you check back. That's usually not a correct strategy, and it's in fact a very, very losing strategy. In theory, not even talking about exploits. After calling a small c-bet and facing a check, we leverage our strong hand advantage by using big sizes, right? When someone c-bets the flop small and then they check the turn, they are representing a very condensed middling range. They're saying, I c-bet the flop with a middling hand, and then I checked the turn with a middling hand. That's their story that they're telling, right? And so what we do is we say, okay, you don't have very strong hands in your range, therefore, or a lot of them, therefore, I'm going to start picking big sizings with my strong hands and with my bluffs, right? That's kind of like how that spot works. Whereas when you face a big bet on flop, the story is very different, right? When you call an overbet on the flop, or a 2/3, 3/4 pot sizing on the flop, call that, and then he checks the turn, now the story is completely different on a brick, for instance, because now he doesn't have middling hands. He wouldn't bet a middling hand for an overbet on the flop, right? He's not going to take a second pair and just overbet the flop, usually. Maybe a little bit of time, but not usually, right? So now that story, what's telling you is, oh, he has a polarized range. He has a lot of air, and then he has some traps that he's using to protect the equity of his air a lot of the time, right? So a lot of air and traps, and some, of course, some middling hands as well, but a higher density of traps. And so we will attack that range with smaller sizes, right? We will want to bet our middling hands for equity denial and that sort of stuff without trying to run too often into those traps. Right? Very different details that if you pay attention to a spot and you use your intuition, you will get to, like, these are spots where an exploitative player can come to a very similar conclusion as a GTO player, where if you really think about the ranges involved, it does make sense. After betting small and checking, you attack with big sizings. After betting big and checking, you attack with small sizings. Whoops. So let's look at ace, king, 4, 6. And we're going to look at the different sizings and how we change our stabbing the turn strategy. All right. So we're in the spot. We called the small c-bet on ace, king, 4, and the 6 comes. So just a slam dunk brick, right? And our strategy is big sizing. Now, the way I would approach this is picking one sizing and then checking. That's how I would do it. You could pick 2 if you want, but that's kind of how I would do it. And I think anything from a small overbet to a 75% type sizing is going to be fine. What wouldn't be so good would be a small bet, right? Because what the story he's telling, once again, is he bets small and then he checks turn. That kind of looks like a king. That kind of looks like a pair of 8s, a 4, etc., right? And our advantage comes from the fact that he is mostly going to c-bet the turn with good top pairs, right? We have ace 10, we have ace 9, but he's mostly just going to bet the turn with those. We have 6s that we hit on the turn. We have ace 6, we have 6, 4, That's the kind of range we're leveraging. Right? Whereas when we face an overbet, which is the preferred sizing on this flop, when we face an overbet, we call. When he checks the turn, it's a completely different story. Right? Now we basically only use small sizings. Right? Something between half pot and 1/3 would be an okay sizing to pick here. And the main idea is basically what I said. Now the story he's telling is very different. Now when he overbets the flop and checks the turn, he's not saying I have 8 or I have a king. He's saying I have air, or maybe sometimes every now and again I have like a relatively good hand, right? And so what we want to do against that range is, for example, take a queen 4, queen 6, right? Some of those one pair has 4-3, 4-2, 7-4, 8-6, right? A bunch of those hands, even king X, even ace X, and just bet small. With some of those hands, we're kind of inducing action, we're doing that type of stuff. And with other hands, we're just trying to deny equity, right? Without running too often into traps, right? That's kind of the idea. So what are the possible mistakes you are making? Well, the most common mistake that people make here is just not understanding their strategy. If you don't know what your strategy is, what you'll probably do is just look at your hand and do something, right? You look at your hand, I'll check, right? I have a king 9, I check back. And you don't know if you don't remember if you called a big bet on flop, a small bet, what the ranges involved are, just check or do whatever for whatever reason. Now, I'm not saying that, for example, checking back king 9 is necessarily a bad play if you have a certain read, right? You have a certain read about your opponent and you think that checking back is good. Okay, that's cool. But if you don't know that this hand here is very likely, or at least fairly reasonable to bet, whereas when you call a small bet and the 6 comes, it's not the same, right? It's not the same. It's okay, but it's not the same. You're probably just going to be using all kinds of sizings in all kinds of spots, just kind of randomly playing, right? That's a very common mistake. And the only fix for that is just learning more poker, right? Having a more well-studied strategy. So what are, and also another mistake, another very common mistake is, for example, having a hand like Jack 3. So this is very similar to the flop, right? So being equity driven. So having a Jack 3 of diamonds here and thinking, oh, I have a bad hand, have bad blockers, whatever, check back. Of course, checking back is not bad. Like none of these plays are playing bad, but it causes your checking range to be very weak, right? You got to be careful with those things. What you don't want to do generally, especially after calling a big bet, right? Let's say we call a big bet. And let's say we have 10, I guess. Let's say we have a flush draw. Let's say we have just a low flush draw. Let's say we check the turn. And the river, it could be whatever. We don't generally check all the way to the river with air. In fact, for example, with this hand, look at how big of a mistake it would be. Betting immediately gains about 7 big blinds per instance. So that's 700 big blinds per 100, while checking gains 0. Right, so huge mistake. If you make one of these mistakes every 100 hands, right, one of these mistakes every 100 hands, you lose 7 big blinds per 100, right? So you have to be very careful about that. You have a range advantage. Why do we? Well, we've talked about this in other presentations, but basically the idea is after calling a bet and your opponent checking, right? You call a bet and then your opponent checks. He is capping himself to some extent, and he has a lot of air, while you are, by calling the bet, condensing your range towards middling hands, and also like good hands. So you have a decent amount of value bets, but you don't have a lot of air to pick from. So you need to start picking this kind of hands pure, right? If you get here with 7-3 and it's like, oh, RNG, just 50-50, well, you're making a huge mistake, right? So that's a possible mistake that you could be making. Be careful about that. Don't give up river when you have a range advantage, and be aware and be trained at being good at telling when you have a range advantage and when you don't. But yeah, honestly, like a lot of the mistakes that people make are going to have to do very similarly with the flop. So you could have an opponent that's equity driven, and so when he checks, he's very weak. You can attack that. You can have an opponent that's aggro trappy, so he could be just very, very, very trappy in the turn check. You have to be careful against the checks. You could have opponents that are just completely ABC, right? If an opponent just ABC bet flop, ABC check flop, then what you would want to do is pick very big sizings and very thin for value, as long as you are beating his very capped checks. Right? So similar things as on the flop. At the end of the day, exploiting, once you know the leak, exploiting is basically the same always. Not the same conclusion, but the same process. The incentives are very similar. When someone has a strong range, you avoid bluffing against that range, right? When someone has a weak range, you bet more against that range. You bluff more against that range. When someone has a too condensed / capped range, you value bet bigger, you value bet thinner, right? The concepts are always the same, but, you know, there comes your ability to gather information, to interpret showdowns, to see what people are doing wrong or right, and that's how you build your own deviations. So, to summarize, we are going to make sure that our flop game is on point, okay? By studying GTO in general, just by being diligent about learning the game. And as a side note, with those drills, that little tip that I shared about the study routine, learn about opponent tendencies and attack certain lines, right? If you're in anonymous pools, you can learn about your population reads. If you're in non-anonymous pools, you could also learn about population reads, but also about specific opponents by looking at their showdowns, looking at the HUD, etc. Always keep in mind the polarity of ranges and how much value to bluff your range contains. Okay, meaning the sizings that you pick, it's not like 100% or 0%. Like there's not like one sizing that if you don't pick that specific sizing, everything is ruined, right? But there's usually sizings that are clearly wrong. Right? It's not about whether you pick pot or overbet or 80% pot, but it's about not picking the clearly wrong sizing, right? Based on the polarity of the ranges. And also be aware that when you call a bet, especially a bigger bet, you will have value bets, but you don't have a lot of candidates for bluffing. So you need to bluff more. Whereas when you call a smaller bet, you have to bluff a little bit less, right? Or when you don't call, when the flop just goes check, check, now you have a lot of air to pick from. So you got to be more careful about what types of showdown hands you can just check down to showdown, if you can ever give up with complete air, that type of stuff. Thanks for watching, guys. Hope you liked it. Hope you find it helpful. And see you in the next one.